Hello, it's Anthony Chadwick from the Webinar Vet, welcoming you to another episode of VETchat. Very fortunate today to have Ian Wright on the line. Ian is a veterinary surgeon in Fleetwood, also holds the position of chair and lead at ESCAP. But perhaps tell us a little bit about that. As well as doing all of the stuff that you do on parasitology, you also have your own practice as well. So tell us a little bit about how the practice is going and a bit about what being chair of ESCAP entails.
Okay, well, thanks for the invite. First of all, it's been a little while since we've caught up, so it's wonderful to see you, albeit virtually, but always a pleasure. So yeah, for those who don't know me, I'm a vet in first opinion practice. So working at the Coalface in Fleetwood, which is a lovely little seaside town. It's a peninsula, so we have reps that always visit us and say, "Oh, we were just passing through." No one passes through Fleetwood. This is the edge of the world. It's like Irish Sea. That's it, essentially. So it's lovely little town. We're just a small 2-vet independent practice. But alongside that, I have my love, in no way an obsession. It's my gentle love of parasites. So, I did it way back in, crikey, 1997. Is that 25 years ago? Can't be.
It
Yeah,
is,
25
isn't it?
years
Yeah.
ago, I did a master's in parasitology, trying to get into vet school, and just loved it. So carried on doing some research, wrote some articles, and now I find myself as head of ESCAP nationally and guideline director for ESCAP. So ESCAP gives guidance on parasites. It publishes guidelines. We give free advice through our website. So yeah, every day there's another parasite adventure, which some of it's exciting, some of it's a little bit scary sometimes, but parasites is never a dull moment.
Well, I think similarly share your love of parasites. As a dermatologist,
Yeah,
it was always great fun to scrape a dog, find a scabies mite that nobody else had found.
yeah,
It was always a bit of a eureka moment in the back
yeah.
office with me looking down my microscope.
It is, isn't it? You just
Yeah,
can't beat that moment of deep satisfaction when you find something that's crawling around under the
yes,
microscope. It's like
yeah.
results. Yeah.
Yes, we know what the dog's problem is. It's
Well, yeah,
probably
that's
not
it.
A to
Yeah.
B. We can get this dog better, which is
Yep.
which is fabulous. Ian, obviously, at VetChat, we do talk a lot about sustainability and things, and
Yeah.
global temperatures are rising. Um, we're starting to see some diseases that we've not seen before in the UK, and
No,
some
very much so.
unusual ticks and so on, like Rhipicephalus.
Mm.
Obviously, partly some of this is coming from the increase in temperature, but also from a lot more pets are being imported. In fact, it's becoming such a big problem. It's kind of becoming almost criminal, isn't it, with some of the gangs
Yeah.
importing pets over because
Mm.
of the shortage of dogs that we've certainly experienced during the pandemic. Obviously, from the perspective of traveling pets going on holiday to places like France and Germany, that particular element just sort of disappeared during the pandemic. But I know that
Mm.
it's sort of coming back up again. And I must admit, as a vet who's not been in practice for quite a while, I'd love perhaps first to start by just talking a little bit about that animal health certificate situation that we're having,
Yeah.
and what does that entail? What should we be treating? And do you think there's areas that, in fact, we're not treating appropriately, and this is why some of these new parasites are being seen?
Yeah, yeah. So there is, what we describe as a sort of cocktail of risk that's making sort of new novel parasites arriving in the UK more likely. So it's absolutely not just a UK phenomenon. So
Mm.
right across Europe. Globally, the range of many parasites and the vectors like mosquitoes, fruit flies, ticks, that transmit them are increasing. So their range is increasing, their activity year round is increasing. So that makes the likelihood of encountering them if you're abroad or if you're adopting a pet from abroad, that the chances of encountering them becomes more likely. And that's coupled with the frequency. So, of you visiting or these pets being imported. So, you're absolutely right. Global warming, increased humidity across large areas, increased habitat, so increased forestation, has led to sort of more ticks, more mosquitoes, more fruit flies extending their ranges. But coupled with that, you've got more and more pets and people are being moved around, through
Mm.
choice or, through necessity. And part of that in the UK is definitely pet travel and importation. So on the pet travel side, before COVID, you had a pet passport. And none of us enjoyed filling out pet passports, but there were at least one document, and you filled it out, and the client had it for a few years, and you sent them off on their way. Animal health certificates are a completely different ballpark. So you have to fill one out. I mean, these are like 9 to 12 page documents. You have to fill one out every time the pet goes abroad. And the sort of health requirements that go with them are still the same. So you need your rabies vaccination, you have to have been microchipped. And crucially, you still have to have the tapeworm treatment to prevent Echinococcus multilocularis, which a really nasty zoonosis that we don't want in the UK. That compulsory treatment is still in place, coming back in. So those requirements haven't changed. It's just the sheer volume of paperwork. I mean, cry
Mm.
tears of joy, every time one lands on my desk that I have to do. And I thought it would put people off. I thought the increased
Yeah.
cost, would put people off. But just gradually, I've noticed over the past sort of 6, 8 months this year, really, that numbers have started to creep up. So we need to be up to speed with the advice that we're giving because there's no real sort of compulsory parasite elements apart from the tapeworm. So we need to be up to speed with the advice we're giving when people are going on holiday with their pets as to, what tick prevention they need, whether they need heartworm prevention, prevention against leishmania. But we also have to be very, very aware that lots of the pets that are being imported, mostly dogs, being imported into the UK as sort of charity rescues, can also, I mean, they've been living in countries that have many pathogens that aren't endemic in the UK.
Mm.
So we need to make sure that sufficient sort of vigilance and sort of screening for those parasites, really, because they're likely to already have them, is in place
Mm.
for when those pets arrive on the consulting room table. I mean, in an ideal world, that the charities would have done some of this testing before they come across. And we are
Yes.
we are working, ESCAP's working with charities to try and, help them put the right testing in place. But there's a spectrum there as to the degree of sort of finances, investment, desire to do it
Mm.
that the charities have. I think it is
Just to,
important to say. Sorry. Go on, Anthony.
yeah, no,
You've
just
got me
to,
on. You've got me on a roll. You got me on a roll.
yeah, a few questions come up. The AHC, how much, what's the sort of standard charge for doing one of those now then?
It's massively variable. And I don't say that to be diplomatic, but it's massively variable. So
Yeah.
I've seen individual ones as cheap as, I say as cheap, but given the amount of paperwork there is, as cheap as sort of 100, 150, going right through to sort of 350, £400. But the thing is, practices charge in different ways because you can add pets on. So up to 5 pets can travel, and you can add the second, third, fourth, fifth pet onto the same animal health certificate.
Right.
So most practices tend to charge a fee for the first pets and then a sort of surcharge for additional pets.
Yeah.
So it is hugely variable, but what is absolutely certain is that it's much more expensive than just having Add Your Pet Passport that you can just
Mm.
use once.
And this AHC, as we say, can only be used once. So it's for that one trip, and then
Yeah.
if you go back a month
Yeah.
later, 2 months, 3 months later, you have to do another one.
The trick is that you can use it to move around the EU for sort of
Yes.
3 or 4 months. So, once you're out there, you want to really
Yes.
make the
You're
most of it
okay.
and go on a bit of a
Yeah.
road trip or, have a tour. But no, if you come back into the UK, you've then got to get another one and, off you go again.
One of the things that was in the pet passport was very much, that worry about some of the tick-borne diseases that
Yes.
animals
Mm.
would be treated on the way back. And of course, sometimes just treating them on the way back was foolhardy because, of course, they'd had the disease already while they were
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
So they could catch the disease before. So it makes sense still, doesn't it, to treat before the animal goes out and then to treat as it comes back in again, provided obviously you're not over treating, if it's monthly treatment or whatever. I mean, do you feel that that's been a loss within the system that we're not treating for ticks routinely as part of this AHC?
Yeah, it's a danger because you've lost that compulsory element, and you're absolutely right. Just having a compulsory tick treatment for coming back into the UK isn't going to stop exotic pathogens and ticks coming in because no tick treatment is 100% effective. And
Yes.
it depends which one you put on, and it depends when you put it on in relation to the pet
Yeah.
coming back. No, I mean, ideally, you want to treat a pet, you want to start before you go, and then you want to treat while you're out there, and then you want to treat before they come back. And,
Yeah.
that's to try and minimize the risk of exposure to exotic pathogens. What dropping the compulsory element did, unfortunately, I think was send the wrong message. You
Yeah.
drop the compulsory treatments, and that is a signaler to pet owners that perhaps it's just not that important to have tick
What?
prevention
Why do
while
you?
you're out there.
Why do you think that the government actually dropped that in the first place? Because to me, from the outside, not as expert as you are in parasitology, just seems a really silly thing to do.
Well, I think in terms of the messaging, it was, and it made the messaging very difficult. So you've got the, off the record reason, and you've got the on the record reason. So the on the record reason is actually very sensibly thought out. So the reason it was introduced was because of something called Mediterranean spotted fever, which I think, anything called
Yeah.
Mediterranean spotted fever you want to avoid if you can.
Yes.
It's transmitted by Rhipicephalus ticks. And the argument was that because it was a significant zoonosis and these dogs might be carrying Rhipicephalus, then you should have that compulsory treatment in place. The reason it was dropped officially was because tick treatments aren't 100% effective. And because of our ambient temperatures, it was felt that Rhipicephalus was unlikely to establish in the UK and be a permanent problem, which is fair. Um, I mean, the off the record reason was it was political horse trading. It was like, well, you want to keep your compulsory tapeworm treatment, we're going to have the compulsory tick treatment
Yeah.
taken off, and
Taken off.
it was a negotiation. The problem with it is that actually Rhipicephalus can persist in the UK, but it's in people's centrally heated homes. So, if any ticks get through, but certainly if a goodly number get through, they like our houses. They can feed on anything that moves. So the larvae, the nymphs, the adults can all feed in the house and
Yeah.
complete their life cycle in the house. So before you know it, you've got hundreds of them climbing out of the skirting boards, down the back of your sofa. And
Oh my goodness. And is
yeah,
this becoming a problem? Because,
it is. Yeah.
Rhipicephalus was a very rare parasite. Is it establishing itself through the country, presumably starting in the south? But maybe, as you said, if people are traveling, it can be all over if they're living in people's houses.
Well, yes. So this is happening throughout Europe. So Rhipicephalus outdoors needs a bit of a tropical, it likes an umbrella in its drink. It likes a bit of a sunbed. It
Yes.
doesn't really like our cold ambient temperatures.
Yeah.
But it is surviving in Northern Europe in people's houses and can do that here. I mean, its risk of long term establishment in the UK is actually still very low. The problem
Yes.
is that, ticks get into the house, they start feeding on things in the house, and then they can transmit
Including
zoonotic,
humans.
yeah, including humans. So
Yeah.
then they can transmit zoonotic disease, and that is a big concern. So, just because my take home message would be is just because the compulsory treatment's been dropped, you know, doesn't mean that, really good, solid tick treatment and checking for ticks while pets are abroad, is still really important.
It's interesting. Obviously, Mediterranean spotted fever, a cousin of Rocky Mountain spotted fever,
Yeah.
presumably.
And yeah, absolutely. There are a sea of rickettsia that Rhipicephalus can transmit. And whichever sort of, country where Rhipicephalus is endemic, you find your own fascinating version of a rickettsial pathogen that can be transmitted. So in North America, it's Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Africa has a range of rickettsia that are zoonotic that can be transmitted. Up in the Mediterranean, it's Mediterranean spotted fever, and on it goes. So they're very, very well adapted, Rhipicephalus, to transmitting a range of pathogens. And unfortunately, some of those are ones that we can catch.
You mentioned a really challenging disease before that I'd be interested to know how that is doing in the country. And obviously, very much a problem with imported animals, obviously, rescue animals coming from the south of Europe, and that's Leishmania.
Yeah.
It's a really difficult disease to sort of diagnose because pretty much any
Mm.
dog that you bring out of Spain or Portugal will probably have Leishmania, won't it? So, how is that going? Are we seeing more cases in the UK of Leishmania, and is that
Yeah.
a big
Yeah.
increase or just a small increase?
Well, unfortunately, because there's no official recording of Leishmania cases, we don't know how big the increase is. I don't
Yeah,
think there's any vet in the land that hasn't got a feeling of they're seeing more Leishmania cases than they did
yeah.
before. And that, just those sort of anecdotal case recordings, and I mean, the number of queries that we get into to ESCAP about Leishmania cases would suggest that there are significantly more than there were before. I mean, most of them, not all of them, but most of them are in imported or travel pets. But
Hmm.
one of the sort of misunderstandings, one of the misnomers about leishmania is that people believe that you have to have the sandfly for it to be transmitted.
Hmm.
And there's a number of ways that leishmania can be transmitted. Mostly vertical transmission, sort of horizontal transmission through mating, but also through dog bites and cases where we just don't know. We just don't
Hmm.
know how that transmission has occurred. So it is, I mean, it's more at the moment, it's more of a concern for the individual patient. I mean, leishmania is
Yeah.
serious and it needs a lifetime of management. So diagnosis is important early on for the individual patient, but I don't think we can be complacent about the risks of it establishing, at least focally, in the
Hmm.
UK when horizontal transmission is possible.
And obviously has a zoonotic implication. And I think, as you said, I think it was Susan Shaw early on, probably 10, 20 years ago, seemed to suggest that fleas might be involved in that transmission from dogs who had travelled to those that hadn't. So we're beginning to see more and more cases, are we, of dogs that simply haven't left the country as well?
Yes, yeah, and in the vast majority of those, we know how. So you have to get the thing with leishmania, suspected leishmania cases, is you do have to get a really good history. So, let's say there's vertical transmission. So, mum might have had it, but there's also venereal transmission. So, it might be that dad
Hmm.
had it and gave it to mum.
Yeah.
So, you might have travelled dad and not have had travelled mum or travelled
Yeah.
offspring. So that's the most common way, but it's also transmitted through blood transfusions, so it can occur that
Yeah.
way. The big question is there have been a couple of cases in the UK where we don't know, where none of those things, as far as we know, have occurred. And we don't know what the transmitting mechanism is. Now, there
Mm.
are trypanosomes that have moved into biting flies.
Yes.
Trypanosoma vivax jumped from tsetse flies to biting midges and horse flies in South America. So we know that's possible, but it hasn't been confirmed that Leishmania has
Yeah.
moved into another vector yet. So,
Like a flea or whatever.
fingers crossed. Yeah, we don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, it is really, from the zoonotic aspect, it is really important to say that there hasn't been a confirmed case worldwide of someone contracting the disease from a dog in the absence of the sandfly vector.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
although there is a theoretical risk there, it is incredibly low.
The
I think as
zoonotic
long as
risk is
everyone's,
low.
hand hygiene is good, as long as
Yeah.
staff are very careful, veterinary staff are very careful with needles where blood samples have been taken
Yeah.
and sort of bodily fluid spillage, you have to be a bit careful there. But I'm saying this, I'm going to catch it next week, aren't I? I'm saying this,
Yeah.
on a podcast, but you do have to
Yeah.
work quite
Quite
hard
hard to
to
get it.
contract leishmania if there are no sandflies around. So,
You were also talking before about the geneticist's favourite insect, which of course is Drosophila. What's the story there? What's the worry with Drosophila? Because I
well,
am seeing them in the house
specifically,
as well.
so I don't want to slander fruit flies.
Worry us
But
all.
they're actually Phortica fruit flies that are the problem.
Right.
They
Ah,
trans
right. Okay.
they transmit Phalasia calopida, the eye worm. So that
Ah,
is
right.
something that really could establish in the UK. So Phortica loves warm weather. It loves trees. It loves to, hang out in an apple grove where it is living the dream. It's nice, it's warm, it's humid. And as a result, it's been able, because of global warming, it's been able to expand its range across Europe very quickly. And it's aided by mechanical movement. So, Fortica will catch a lift in people's trucks,
In
they'll
Apple
get
and
around,
so on.
but also wind dispersed very easily as well.
Yeah.
They're tiny flies.
So are we
Um,
seeing them in the UK already?
so now we are starting to see foci in the south of England of Fortica establishing. But the worry is that climate modelling shows that it is going to spread. So it's going to
Yeah.
establish very widely over, certainly England, over the next 5, 10 years. And you'd say, well, it's a cute little cuddly fruit fly. Why should we worry about that? But Fortica also feeds on eye secretions. So they like to gather around the eyes of animals and people. And they're so small, you just wouldn't know they were doing it. You might rub your eye while you're out for a walk, but you wouldn't know they'd ever been there. And in doing that, they can transmit this eye worm, which is really quite unpleasant. So, like
Right.
many of these things, it's not a direct risk from dogs. But if we have imported dogs that come in with the infection, our native fruit flies feed on them, there's the risk of establishment, and then they'll feed on us and we'll get eye worm
Mm.
cases. And this has happened in every country where Fortica's gone, Falasia's followed, and then you get human cases. So,
Mm.
again, we just need to be very, very vigilant for possible clinical cases or, carriers coming into the UK. And then if we can identify the parasite quickly, it's much better for the individual patient to get those to get those worms shifted out of your eye,
Yeah.
but also, to try and prevent that establishment.
And do we treat that in humans with ivermectin for the eye worms?
So it's a very similar idea in dogs and cats. So that there are products now that are licensed for treatment, sort of moxidectin and milbemycin products, but also physically under sedation, local anaesthetic, just flushing the worms out physically makes a big difference as well.
Right. So they're in sort of tear ducts and meibomian glands and things like
But they
that.
just live in the conjunctival sac. So, you can
Oh,
see them
wow.
conscious. If you've got a
Yeah.
really compliant patient, you can lift the eye down.
Yes.
But if they're not so compliant, you sedate them, pull it round, you
Yes.
can see the worms crawling out across the surface. There are some wonderful
Uh,
photos on the internet that you can check out of some lovely, juicy Phalasia infections.
have you seen any of these yourself in practice yet?
I haven't seen a case personally. I've been sent plenty of Phalasia worms, which are
Yes.
actually very quickly free plug. So, surveillance for these parasites is really important. And the APHA working with ESCAP in England has a service now, a free service. So if you think you have these worms, so Phalasia, Dirofilaria repens, or the nasal pentastamid, Linguatula serrata. If you think you've got any of those free, you can send them to the APHA to be identified, to have their identification confirmed, but then they'll also be registered as part of UK surveillance. So we can watch out for where sort of, imported pets are staying, whether there's untraveled cases, if there's the risk of crossover into national insect populations.
Hmm. Just a final one, Ian. There's obviously a lot of press and publicity at the moment around our treatments of parasites. And disclosure from myself, I was probably one of the first practices that did a VIP plan back in 1999. Um, do you think, is there a danger that we can be over treating animals? And how would you advise practices now, perhaps with healthcare plans? Should we be doing more surveillance first? So things like doing fecal egg counts and obviously flea combings? Or do you think it's okay to just continue to treat, across a sort of blanket population?
Wow. Well, that's quite a big question. So
Take
I'm gonna try and
your time. Take your
yeah, if we've
time.
got time, I'm going to try and pick that
Yeah.
apart a little bit. So, first of all, there's the issue of what we call, or what's been described as blanket treatment. So blanket treatment implies that you treat everything all of the time without thought. And there was a colleague of mine who said this on webinars recently, but a colleague of mine that just said, well, parasitology is easy. You just kill all the parasites all of the time and everything dies. And then everyone feels
Yeah.
better and, you're all good. And, that's tongue in cheek, but, that is one extreme view. But, we have to, when we take that approach, we have to consider the consequences. So the consequences may be that overtreatment will occur, that some of these pets don't need that treatment all of the time, that environmental contamination might occur. And then there's the thorny question of resistance, which if we've got time, I'll speak about briefly because I think there's a little bit of sort of confusion about what we're trying to achieve there. So, but I think we can agree as a whole, I think most people in the profession agree that we need a risk-based approach. So you only want to treat the pets that need the treatment preventatively. And some parasites lend themselves really well to a risk-based approach. So if we take tapeworm or if we take lungworm or ticks, then they're not present, certainly not present uniformly throughout the whole country. So, there's geographic risk factors and there's certain lifestyles that might put you at more risk. So, cereal, slug and snail consumption, being on an unprocessed raw diet, having dogs that munch their way through sheep carcasses, you've got lifestyle
Yeah.
risk factors that
Lots
you
of
can.
things going on there.
Yes, with those, because like I say, they are a parasite that lends themselves to that type of risk assessment. So we should absolutely be making those risk assessments. So yeah, so lungworm and tapeworm and ticks really lend themselves well to risk assessment. But the key, or two of the key parasites that we deal with on a daily basis, Toxocara, the intestinal worm that's zoonotic, and fleas, unfortunately, are ubiquitous throughout the country. In fact, well, in the case of Toxocara, ubiquitous throughout the world, apart from Antarctica. So, wherever you go, those worms and fleas are going to be present. In the case of Toxocara, there is a sort of, certain lifestyles like living with young children, hunting, being a puppy or kitten that make infection more likely. But again, because of the way it's transmitted, transplacentally, transmammary, there's no, throughout a cat and dog's life, any cat or dog could be exposed to Toxocara at any time.
Yeah.
And similarly with fleas, because of the way fleas are moved around mechanically, even completely indoor cats can and are regularly exposed to fleas. So, because both fleas and Toxocara cause significant sort of zoonotic, and in the case of fleas, things like flea allergic dermatitis, we can't just ignore them. We have to have control in place for them, and it's much more difficult to apply sort of risk assessments to them. So AirSCAP UK and Ireland currently still recommends a minimum of 4 times a year deworming year round for Toxocara because of the zoonotic risk, and monthly for high risk, perhaps with the exception of indoor cats that poo in their litter tray and then the poo is removed and hygiene's really good. It's all taking place in an enclosed system. Perhaps with that exception, 4 times a year minimum. And because of flea allergic dermatitis, because of the zoonotic risks with things like Bartonella, and because no cat or dog is safe from infestation, we recommend year-round flea control. Now, I mean, it may be, for all cats and dogs. Now, I mean, it may be that evidence will change. I mean, there are countries, Spain, Scandinavia, where because of, more significant climate shifts, fleas aren't year-round problems. So, this
Mm.
isn't, things can change, but at the moment, on the current evidence, I believe that's where we are. So, you know, I guess that the summary message is that risk assessment is really important, but just because you risk assess doesn't mean that cats and dogs don't need year-round treatment for some parasites. And you
Mm.
need to establish which ones those might be. So, that's risk assessment. Practice plans have come in for a lot of knocking. So you know poor old practice plans. People say, oh, practice plans are terrible things because you just, you have the routine treatment and you have a lack of choice, all year round. But the big advantage of practice plans is that they improve compliance, because the clients are locked in to picking up whatever
Mm.
treatments you decide them to pick up. They can be combined with reminder systems, but also they can be hugely flexible with still using relatively few products. So, you can have bespoke practice plans. I mean, at our practice, we focus on sort of 3 or 4 main products. But if that's not suitable on the basis of a risk assessment, we can order in 24 hours pretty
Mm.
much any product that anyone needs. So practice plans don't have to be inflexible, and they can include testing, which is also a sort of big sort of point of conversation at the moment. So I don't think we should be dismissive of practice plans. I think they're actually quite useful, but they're a tool, and like all
Mm.
tools, they depend on how you use them. They're not inherently bad or good themselves.
Just, Ian, going back, obviously with the testing, fecal egg counts, does that allow us to perhaps limit, our Toxocara use, which, obviously, again, in practice, when I had my practice, I would talk about the risk of ocular Toxocara in children and young adults, and saying whilst it was quite rare, if it's your child that gets affected in their sight, then that's something that is really, really difficult. So do you think that if we're testing twice a year for for eggs, or perhaps because 4 times seems a lot. That we'd need a lot of nurse involvement to do that, wouldn't we? We'd need to have a nurse involved in doing a lot of fecal egg flotations. How do you think that might fit in, or do you just don't think it's very practical?
Okay, so again, there's a lot of points there. So I'll try and briefly
Yeah,
just sort of break them
yeah,
down. So, in terms of testing, you have to say, well, what are you aiming to achieve by the testing? So, in ruminants and horses, testing has been incredibly successful. And that's because you're trying to limit resistance mostly. I mean, environmental contamination
mm,
is good, but it's mostly resistance you're trying to limit. And you're trying to limit that by identifying through testing low shedders. So not
yeah,
negative animals, but low shedders, and you're going to deliberately allow them to shed. So then you get
yeah,
refugia in the environment and you limit resistance as a result. The
yeah,
problem with cats and dogs is that Toxocara is zoonotic. So, you don't limit resistance by not treating negative animals. So you don't limit resistance by finding a cat and dog that isn't infected and saying, well, we've discovered that, so we're not going to treat them. You only
mm,
limit resistance by deliberately allowing shedding. So, it's a much more difficult conversation to have to go to a client and say, well, your cat and dog's only shedding, really small numbers. So, there's still a risk, I mean, you might still
mm,
get sick, but it's really low risk. So, we're going to let you take one for the team so we can limit resistance in the
yeah,
longer term. Is a very difficult, ethically, a very difficult conversation to have. So the aims for livestock fecal egg counts are not the same as they would be
yeah,
in small animal practice. So in small animal practice, we'd be looking for cats and dogs that aren't shedding to reduce
mm,
use overall. The problem there, again, is its zoonotic nature. So shedding is intermittent, it comes and goes. So testing every year or every 6 months doesn't tell you what's happening in between.
mm,
So you would have to, so if you're going to use it as an alternative, you would have to test much more frequently. So 4 to 12 times a year. And that may be an option. Some people may want to do that. And that may be something that you can put on practice plans, maybe as an alternative option. But that frequent testing, does have an expense component. It has a time component
yeah,
associated with it. Where I would like to see testing, especially on practice plans, is alongside that treatment. So, one of the ways that we can limit resistance is to detect it early. And the only way that you're going to do that is by doing some testing to demonstrate
mm,
that your regimes are actually working. So, is resistance present? Is compliance good? Is your treatment frequency, if you've done a risk assessment, is it frequent enough? You can only assess those things by doing fecal testing alongside treatment, but that can be done less frequently. So that could be done on a practice plan, say once, twice a year. Even once a year would give you useful
mm.
information. So
What what's the obviously you treat 4 times a year with a milbemycin type product, or
yeah,
whichever wormer you want to use. How long is it before Toxocara could appear again? Because milbemycin doesn't stay in the system for 3 months, does it?
no, it doesn't, and that's the issue. So 4 times a year does not guarantee elimination of shedding. I mean, even
Yeah,
monthly doesn't, but it's probably 90% plus if you're doing it monthly.
yeah,
So, there is a shedding risk once you go below monthly. So, what you're having to do when you're making your risk assessment is you're balancing zoonotic risk against the other things that you might be
mm,
wanting to limit, like environmental risk. So it is a balance, and I have to pick up, Anthony. You said that
yeah,
ocular toxocorosis is rare.
yeah,
Ocular toxocorosis is rare, but it's just one of many forms that toxocorosis can take.
yeah,
And the others are much more difficult to diagnose. And reporting, it's not a notifiable disease. So, GPs actually have to pick these up They have to diagnose them, which isn't easy, and then they have to report them. So, it's very, very
Mm,
likely that any reported Toxocara cases are huge underestimates
yeah.
of the number of us that have been exposed in the population.
Similar to Leishmania.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Ian, this has been fascinating as always. Parasitology is such an interesting topic, and you talk about it with great passion. So
Well,
it's
thank
been
you for
great
just
having you
letting
on.
me roll on, roll on. You've got to stop me at
Yeah,
some point, haven't you? Otherwise, we'll be here all
no,
afternoon.
but it's been good, and I hope people who've been listening have enjoyed it. And yeah, I'm Anthony Chadwick. This was Vet Chat, and hopefully see you on another episode very soon.
Thank you
Bye
very
bye.
much. Take care.